During this time, both economies grew significantly. However, financial crises were more frequent and severe in the US than they were in British North America or Canada.
The government of Canada under John A. Macdonald says banking is very important. The Americans are next door. The American economy is growing by leaps and bounds. We have a fragile economy. Let's make sure that we're not suffering the highs and lows of bank failures that would cripple our system.
During that time, in the United States of America, there were bank failures and extreme inflation caused by the Civil War.
In the case of Canada, by the time the Canadian institutions were set up, nearly 100 years after the American Revolution, the concept of the financial institution was much better established, not in the USA particularly, but in Britain and in France, for example. So I think Canada just benefited from more human experience in democratic countries in this area.
So we have an act called the British North America Act, is passed and proclaimed on July 1st, 1867, which makes banking and currency federal responsibilities. So you got a brand new country, you got a whole raft of things you've got to do, and this was compounded in the banking sphere because the two largest banks in what is now Ontario and the second and third largest bank in all of Canada both failed.
Alexander Tilloch Galt, Canada's first finance minister and a shareholder in one of the failed banks, demanded a government bailout. As a result, he was replaced by Sir John Rose.
So the combination of the failure of the Bank of Upper Canada, the failure of the commercial bank, really put the idea in the government that something had to be done to fix the banks, to come to some agreement. The banks wanted federal support.
Now, John Rose brought in a piece of legislation in 1869, a Bank Act, and the effect of it would have been to take the Bank of Montreal and, in essence, make it like the Bank of England, and the rest of the banks would be little county banks. Well, you can imagine the reaction that caused.
The Prime Minister recognized that Rose had outlived his usefulness, and he resigned. Macdonald then asked Sir Francis Hincks to become his third finance minister in 3 years.
Rose, I believe, was just a fill-in. He was a kind of person that Macdonald moved around as a troubleshooter. And then he brought Hincks back. He'd been a governor in the Caribbean and in British Guiana, and set him up as Minister of Finance, and he was extremely effective. I think it would be perhaps adding a cubit to his stature to say that he was in the class of Alexander Hamilton, but he wasn't far short of it.
He was energetic, and he went out and consulted politicians, he consulted news editors, he consulted bankers, and he brought forward a Bank Act which became the foundation stone of banking in Canada.
It's not a bulletproof assurance, but there's an assurance that the banking system is going to be stable, and that stability will be achieved because the banks are under strict orders not to issue loans that they can't cover, and the assurance that the federal government is looking over them. The Bank Act will be reviewed in 1881, again under John A. Macdonald, and from there, a tradition is built that the Government of Canada will review the Bank Act every decade. That'll eventually become every 5 years.
Very interesting, and as far as I know, unique to us. And it's been very useful. Let us face facts. Banking is not a subject that very many people in public life know anything about. If you don't have that clause or something like it, the system just carries on until it breaks down, and everybody gets up in their soapboxes and says it's a disgrace and demands that all the bankers be thrown in prison and let's start over again. But if you're renewing it every 10 years, you've got a much better chance of acting preveniently and preempting crises.
The most recent example in the United States is you have Dodd-Frank, That legislation came out of the 2007-2008 crisis. It was the first change since the Great Depression, and you had Glass-Steagall passed then. So that's from the 1930s to 2007-8, that's 75 years with no change. Well, when you got something as sensitive as a financial system, how can you make that kind of dramatic change? You have to have a more evolutionary process.
The early founders of corporations in the US, like Hamilton, they believed in checks and balances built right into the corporate charter and right into the bylaws. And I've seen evidence that these persist in Canadian banks. Whereas in the United States, by the late 19th century, there's more and more lip service being paid, and many of those checks and balances were eroded over time, to the point that when the restrictions against branching within states and then across states are lifted, you have very poor bank governance, and so you have bank CEOs who essentially write their own contracts, their own checks.
Banking in North America expanded rapidly on both sides of the border as the economies of Canada and the United States grew dramatically at the start of the new century.